Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon. Before we get going, I thought we should introduce ourselves here. So my name is Santiago Lyon, and I head up education and advocacy for the Content Authenticity Initiative, which we'll spend the next hour talking about, as well as the widespread problems of mis and disinformation. Prior to this, I was Vice President and Director of Photography at the Associated Press for almost 15 years, and before that I was a photographer in the field for 20 years, 10 years of which were spent covering war and conflict around the world. So the notion of authenticity and truth is something that's very dear to my heart, and this initiative is a logical extension of my career thus far of almost 40 years in journalism. Joining me today is Laura Ellis, who is a technologist and journalist with a focus on emerging technology, machine learning, disinformation, and data. She's worked on news teams in radio, TV, and online, and established the BBC's first end-to-end digital newsroom. In her current role, she focuses on ensuring the BBC is best placed to take advantage of emerging technology and takes a particular interest in ethics, personalized and automated journalism, machine learning, and media provenance. Next to her is Phil Chetwynd, who is the Global News Director of Agence France-Presse and has overall responsibility for both the agency's editorial strategy and its 1,700 journalists. He took up this role in 2019 after 6 years as AFP's Paris-based editor-in-chief, during which time he drove AFP's visually led multimedia news strategy and global efforts to tackle disinformation, and previously reported as a special correspondent from 20 countries around the world. And Gary Knight, at the end of the table here, is an award-winning photographer and co-founder and director of the VII Photo Agency. He's also the co-director of the VII Foundation and director and founder of the VII Academy, a major player in photojournalism education. He was also a founding director of the Program for Narrative and Documentary Practice at the Institute of Global Leadership at Tufts University, twice chair and president of the World Press Photo Award, a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and he's worked as a photographer all over the world since the late 1980s, including covering war and conflict. So as you can see, it's quite a, myself excluded, quite an accomplished panel of people here. So what we're going to do is introduce to you what the Content Authenticity Initiative is, a short presentation of about 15 minutes or so, and then after that we're going to start a conversation about mis and disinformation and how do we tackle the problem and what are some potential approaches, etc. So without further ado, I'll get into the presentation. So the Content Authenticity Initiative was founded in late 2019 by Adobe together with the New York Times and Twitter. And the impetus for it was the problem of mis and disinformation that we see creeping into our lives every day, whether it's altered still photography, altered video, misleading stories. The information space has become a battle space, and it's being used by actors large and small, states, governments, militaries, politicians, and they're taking advantage of the technology that enables things to be created very easily. And since Adobe has a lot of very powerful technology that is most often used for creative and educational and positive purposes, but which sometimes falls into the hands of bad actors, we felt it was our responsibility to do something about the use of our technology and do something about the problem of mis and disinformation. And that's what led to the Content Authenticity Initiative. Just recently, for example, from the conflict in Ukraine, these are a couple of egregious examples that were gathered by Phil and his team at AFP. On the left-hand side, you can see a manipulated image that would appear to show a fire in Lviv near in Ukraine, when in fact the firefighter has a jacket that clearly states he's from Edmonton in Canada. And on the right, you can see what would appear to be Escape from Kiev, dummied up as a screenshot from, I believe, an Italian broadcaster, when in fact it's a still from a movie, Deep Impact. So it gives you an idea, and these are just a couple of examples, it gives you an idea of the nature of the problem. In terms of membership, having started with 3 members in late 2019, we're now at over 700 members. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the major media partners that we've been working with, and the Wall Street Journal is a recent addition to the group, and there'll be more on that to come next week probably. But as you can see, it's a robust group of media partners and growing every day, and we're in conversation with everybody you'd expect us to be in conversation with. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of our major technology partners, ARM, who make the some of the underlying processing technology used by Apple, Microsoft, Nikon as one of the preeminent hardware manufacturers, Qualcomm, who make the image sensors for the Android phone system, as well as Twitter and TruePic. So it's a fast-growing community, and we anticipate that it will probably double in size by the end of this year. When we took a look at the landscape in the fight against mis and disinformation, we identified several areas. When we start with detection, which is what a lot of people imagine technology, how technology interacts with this area, detection typically involves uploading files to programs that look for telltale signs of manipulation. And that aspect of detection has a couple of problems. Number one, it's invariably an arms race with bad actors trying to stay one step ahead of the latest detection software. And two, in its current form at least, it's not really scalable. It just takes too long to run images through detection software. That said, another area of detection is fact-checking. And Phil will talk about what he does at AFP and what his team do around fact-checking. And fact-checking is an increasingly growing sector in the news industry. So detection, well, I've put an asterisk here because it's not what we're focused on. It certainly does have a value in the fight against mis and disinformation. Next, we talk about legislation. Increasingly, governments and lawmakers are legislating the fight against mis and disinformation by making codes of practice or introducing laws against, for example, non-consensual face swapping in pornography and other fields. And so we see that that's an important component of the fight, and Adobe's government relations team works with governments and institutions around the world towards that end. We've done work with the US Senate, we've done work with the European Commission and national governments around the world. Next, we move on to education, and by that we mean media literacy as a subset of digital literacy. And we're in the process of creating educational materials that we will introduce into classrooms around the world for both middle schoolers, high schoolers, and university students. But really what we're focused on in this initiative is provenance. And by provenance, we mean the basic trustworthy facts about the origins of a piece of digital content, whether it's an image, video, an audio recording, or a document, and understanding where something comes from as well as what happens to it along its journey. And so the methodology that we're using here around provenance has four main components. The first one is capture. And so we're working directly with the camera and smartphone manufacturers to integrate this technology into their devices at production, which means that in a couple of years when you go and buy a smartphone or a purpose-built camera, it'll come out of the box with the CAI technology in the device, which the user can then choose to enable or not. If the user chooses to enable the technology because they're interested in having this underlying provenance data associated with it, it does a couple of things. First of all, most devices nowadays generate what we call XMP or EXIF or IPTC data fields, which give us a lot of information about the technical settings of the camera, the time and date something was created, sometimes the location, sometimes even the identity of the creator if it's a registered device. The problem with those data fields is that they're currently not secure. Anybody can go into the IPTC or EXIF data fields and alter them. So one of the things the CAI technology does early on is it secures those data fields. Next, when we talk about editing, it's important to note, and I probably should have mentioned this at the outset, that this is an open source effort. This is not Adobe limited. This is Adobe working to create something that is of benefit to everybody. And so with whatever editing tool you're using, whether it's an Adobe tool or any other commercial editing tool, we integrate the CAI technology into the editing tool so that it tracks and captures, rather, every change that you make to an image in the editing process. So if you crop an image, tone it, darken it, lighten it, each of those get captured as individual actions are then cryptographically stored for later review. So it really, in essence, is an additional layer of metadata that allows you to see the edit history of a piece of content. The third area we talk about is publishing. As most of you probably know, most publishers, whether they're traditional media publishers or social media publishers, strip most metadata off of content very early on in the process. So when you go and look for metadata on news sites or on social media sites, you simply won't find it because it's been removed. And that's often the result of legacy habits dating back to the time when throughput and storage were very different from what they are today. So what we're saying to publishers and content system manufacturers is leave the metadata intact because it's secure, and by leaving it intact, you can then display some or all of it to the user so that they can have a sense of where something came from. And we call these extra layers of metadata content credentials, and they allow the content to be reviewed at any time to understand its provenance. This is a little bit of a deeper look at the sort of fields that we're interested in capturing. So we capture things like the date, the tool that was used, the identity of the creator. When it comes to editing, what date the edits were made, with what tool, by whom, etc. Publishing, who reviewed the image, who published it, when was it published. Sharing, if a social media company decides to compress files to make them more shareable, or reduce file sizes, that would also be captured. So at its broadest, it would capture all of the things on the bottom of this slide. But we understand that not everybody wants to capture all of these things, nor should they in some cases. So for example, human rights defenders who are using photography and video to denounce human rights abuses, the last thing they want on that material is their names, because it could cause them serious problems, especially if they're working under repressive governments. Or journalists working in war zones, the last thing they want to do is reveal their GPS coordinates for the same reasons of security. Or in the same way that newsrooms wouldn't publish a reporter's notebook verbatim, they might not want to show all of the post-production changes that are done to imagery because there's a general lack of understanding about what those processes are in the public, even though for the most part those processes are totally benign. So it's a long way of saying that all of this is completely customizable, and fields can be redacted according to the different use cases. In terms of security, we use things called assertions and asset hashes and manifests. Essentially what we do is the assertions are what was done to an image. The asset hashes bind those changes to the digital file type itself, and then we bundle them together in what we call manifests that also include the signature or the signing authority. And that's important because it bolsters and builds on existing trust models that exist within journalism and which are key to journalism. So this is a way of not only seeing what was done to an image, but also asserting that the publisher is who they say they are. But of course, since what we're aspiring to do here is to create a global standard, we needed to create a global standards organization, one that would be ISO, International Standards Organization, or WC3, Web Standards ratified. And so to that end, about a year ago, we set something up called the C2PA, or the Coalition for Content, Provenance, and Authenticity. This sits within the Linux Foundation, which is the preeminent open source organization in the world, and its members are a subset of CAI members. So if the CAI has approximately 700 members and growing, the C2PA has about 50 members. And their task is very different. They're tasked with writing the standard which underpins the work of the Content Authenticity Initiative, as well as the work of another initiative focused on video workflow called Project Origin, which is being led by the BBC and Microsoft, and which we would consider a sister organization. And so the C2PA is writing the underpinning blueprints, the technical standards. And Adobe sits on the steering committee and chairs the technical working group. And to that end, they released at the end of January this year a version 1 of the technical specification, which is really important because it's the first step on this journey of creating this global standard. And so one way to think about it is the C2PA are the architects, and the CAI, sister organization, are the construction company. And so to that end, we've taken these initial technical specifications and are busy building open source tools that will facilitate their use in a simple and easy way. In terms of where we are, just a quick timeline. Announced in late 2019, a summit meeting in early 2020 that led to the publication of a white paper that laid out everything in layperson's terms. A very important moment at the end of 2020, which was a proof of concept where we demonstrated with customized equipment that this was actually possible to take an image, track the changes, and then expose them. We then founded the C2PA and did a couple of projects, one with the New York Times and one with Reuters news agency. And then we introduced the content credentials into Photoshop as a beta. It's currently there. I'll show you how that works in a minute. And lastly, most recently, we announced the version 1 of the C2PA specs at the end of January. The two projects that we did are worth mentioning. The one with Reuters involved Reuters working with a research lab called the Starling Lab, which is affiliated with Stanford University. And so they sent their photographers out to cover the 78-day period between the US presidential election and inauguration. And what they did was they tethered customized smartphones to their regular camera equipment in order to capture the provenance data indicated here in the little white box. And the Starling Lab chose to house the provenance data on blockchain. The other options to house the provenance data are either in the file itself or in the cloud with a pointer from the file to the cloud. So there are multiple places where the data can be stored. And we worked behind the scenes with both Reuters and the Starling Lab to ensure the integrity of the data and to ensure that it maintained its integrity across different platforms. The New York Times R&D department, as distinct from the editorial department, also did a proof of concept with a customized smartphone, and on the right here you can see what they did to an image. They shot it in color, rotated it, stripped the color, and those changes are reflected. In terms of the integration into Photoshop, this is a really short little video that illustrates this. So I start off with a stock picture of the pyramids. I check to see if it has content credentials, which it does because it came from Adobe stock, so it indicates that it was downloaded from Adobe stock. Now what I'm going to do is significantly alter this image. I'm going to cool it way down, and I'm going to go into an AI function in Photoshop called sky replacement, and I'm going to add some computer-generated clouds. So I do that, but I really want to make it clear that this image was manipulated dramatically. So now what I'm going to do is add an entirely different image that I have ready, and I'm going to embed it on top of this image. So this is now an image of snow, and now I'm going to clear it up so that you can see the pyramids behind it, and lo and behold, I have a picture of the pyramids in a blizzard, which hasn't happened yet. And now I drop down and I check the content credentials again, and I have three elements, the pyramids, the sky, and the snow. Now I'm going to export this file, but before I export it, I'm going to attach the content credentials to it. Now I export it. Fast forward, I'm scrolling through a social media website, and my friend Andrew says, wow, pyramids in Antarctica. Of course, I'm a little skeptical, so I click on the little eye, and it takes me to the back end, which we call verify, and I'm able to compare the elements, and then with this little slider, I'm able to see what I started with and what I ended up with. So that's some of the rudimentary functionality that's currently a beta feature of Photoshop, but that will be available in similar ways to anybody and everybody, given the open source nature of this project. To underscore the three key areas of focus, we have the open standard specification, which is the C2PA. We have the implementation and member collaboration, which is the CAI. And we have advocacy and education, which is also the CAI. And then lastly, a lot of organizations and individuals ask us, well, why should I consider joining the CAI? The first reason is that it's a very public commitment to the fight against misinformation. There's no downside to a media company publicly saying they want to join their colleagues in this fight, and then we'll work later to implement the actual usage as the technology develops. Secondly, we believe that the size and diversity of the community is critical to its success. The weight of some of the partners that I showed earlier, we believe that over time, as we grow and add to the community, we'll really be able to accomplish something, because what we're doing here is not insignificant. We're modifying a large part of the media landscape, and we're also modifying the way people interact, or suggesting the way people might interact with the media in order to understand its provenance. Membership also gives access to the community and the CAI team for technical support. Inclusion in CAI and industry events, which is great ways to learn about what other people are doing, networking, etc. And lastly, it can, in some cases, maintain or create a competitive industry advantage, because it's bolstering the trust model that already exists, but it's reinforcing it by allowing people to see the origins of content. And so that's really what the CAI is all about. And I'm going to leave you with this slide, QR pizza. You've never seen QR pizza before. And so I'm going to leave that up on the screen so that you guys can QR it, and it takes you directly to our website. So while you guys are busy making pictures of our cool QR logo, I am going to start the conversation. And I'd like to start with Phil, because when I approached AFP to introduce this concept to them, different organizations respond in different ways, and it's fair to say that Phil was fast off the mark. Like, he sort of said yes while I was still explaining what was going on. And I wonder if you could talk about what drove that keenness and how does it fit in with AFP's particular approach to mis and disinformation?
Sure. I mean, you're right. When you reached out, to me it was fairly obvious that we have to work together with the industry. So that we have to work together with the industry to find solutions to things that we have now been looking at for over 10 years. I really go back to probably the Syrian conflict, where we first started to see, massive amounts of user-generated content, manipulated content, often very crude, incredibly effective, and realizing that the industry was not at all, capable of dealing with it. A lot of stuff ended up in mainstream media, and I think the sort of wake-up call for us was when we saw some of our photos taken by one of our photographers on the ground in Ghouta used in a disinformation campaign against the White Helmets. So you might remember the people used to drag bodies out of buildings when they're bombed by the Syrian government. And these were real images, but decontextualized to make it look like they were saying that every time there's a bomb, this same child is pulled out of different buildings. In actual fact, it was a series of photos where the child was passed from person to person down the chain, taken by our photographers. So there were simple, true photographers, true photographs, decontextualized, which in a situation like this, if you could click, the right-hand corner of the photo every time, and it could tell you exactly that nothing had been manipulated. But it was too late. There was a very effective disinformation campaign against the White Helmets who really suffered as a result of that. I think the next real phase was 2016. In 2016, we always think of the US election and Donald Trump. But actually, in fact, if you go back 3 months before that, is the election of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, which blindsided everyone, again, because no one was looking in the right place. And the right place was social media, incredibly simple manipulated images at massive volume. Picture of Duterte, arm around the Pope, and the Pope going, vote for Duterte. Again, very simply manipulated, very effective, and had a huge impact in driving the vote to Duterte. And I think at this point really is when you're starting to see a rise in fact-checking, because people were starting to realize, as we think now, that the entire information ecosystem in which we work is really under attack. And if you think we're winning because you're reading the good information in all those news brands, you have to remember how many other people in other parts of the world, could be China, could be India, could be wherever it may be, could be in our own communities, are not believing what we're writing. It's really an existential battle for the news industry as far as I'm concerned. So we now have about 150 people working on lies, 150 journalists who only write about lies, fact-checking truth, which is an astonishing thing for us to find ourselves doing. And I could never really have imagined that when I started off as being editor-in-chief of AFP. And we do about 700 fact checks a month, only really targeting massively viral misinformation. So the scale is immense. And what does it come down to? For us, it comes down to news literacy and what is it sourcing? This is what we're talking about here. We're talking about educating people as to where information comes from. And that's sort of news agency DNA. That every single piece of information, teaching people again to look where information comes from. And that's really collapsed in the world of social media online. People are not really looking there. So these simple solutions that can help people point back towards the source, and in this case, it's a digital source. For words, it could be, hang on, did that come from Zelensky himself? Did it come from Putin? Who did it come from? To us is essential for rebuilding that trust and rebuilding rebuilding news literacy, I would say, teaching people how to interact with information again. And so it's not all going to be a technical solution, but I think it's this combination of technical solution and journalism together that for me makes, to come back to the project we've got on the table here, makes this, an important contribution to the overall project.
Cool, thank you, Phil. You described there the magnitude of the problem. Laura, the BBC is a member of the CAI as well as the C2PA and also Project Origin, which is focused on newsroom video provenance along with Microsoft. As an employee of one of the world's most esteemed broadcasters, I mean, how do you see the problem and what are you guys thinking about and how are you approaching things?
Thanks for the question. Can you hear me okay? Do I need to switch this? There we go. That's better, isn't it? Is that okay? Great. So we started thinking about this just about the time that I left news to go into technology, which was kind of a really interesting pivot because we were just starting then to talk about, what we might do as an organisation to tackle disinformation and misinformation. And one of the things that became clear very, very quickly was, as Santiago's made so brilliantly clear, that this needed to be a collaborative thing. No organisation could do this on their own. We could fact check, we could do our reality checks, but we couldn't work on this in a systemic way without involving partners. And it was just such a joy to find Adobe and others on this path because we kind of discovered each other wanting to work in this space, and it just seemed very logical to join together. And I think that's the power of what we have now. If in those early days you'd have asked me whether we would see provenance signals in news, I'd have said there was probably about a 30% chance that the project would succeed, just because it was so big and it felt so huge and so difficult. But right now, given the support we've had, and we've got new members joining one of the three or all of the three partners all the time, I think this is an industry-changing moment. We are going to start to, sadly, we shouldn't have to, but we're going to start to be using provenance detecting signals in our content, and that's going to be it for the future, I think, particularly given this very, very fractured landscape in social media where you look at something and you do not know where it's come from. It was a terrifying piece of work that came out of the UK regulator Ofcom earlier this week, which said that 30% of people do not question anything they read online. And that when people were tested on what they could see and what they could understand, about disinformation, only 2 out of 10 that felt confident were actually detecting things that were false and that were disinformation. So we need to help people do this, not being patronising, but we need to give them tools. And this is, as Phil says, this is a brick in a big wall that we need to build around how we help people. We help individuals, we help organisations, and at some point, we help the machines that are aggregating this content to understand what is going on with it and what has happened to it on its journey from the source or the putative source through to the consumer, whoever that consumer is. So the BBC feels passionately strongly about this. I think the other thing to say on this is that it's really important to note that this is not something which is going to tell you can trust a piece of content. It's not making a comment on either the journalist or the photographer or the organisation or even the veracity of the material. This is a technology solution. And on top of this, we need to layer all the things that Santiago's mentioned about other trust initiatives. But this is really fundamental because this will help you look at something and say, did CNN publish that? Did the BBC publish that? Has it reached me in the state that it was intended? And I think that's a massively, massively important intervention.
Thank you, Laura. Turning to you, Gary, as I showed at the beginning of the presentation, we've seen from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen the proliferation of mis and disinformation into the headlines, deepfake videos of President Zelensky, decontextualized imagery. It's really catapulted the issue into the headlines. And I know that you have some colleagues from the VII Photo Agency, as well as many other friends and colleagues on the ground in Ukraine working on this, massively important and highly dangerous story. How are you seeing the reaction to their images? Are their images in danger of being dismissed as fake, or what's the dynamic at play there?
Sure. When VII was created 20 years ago, we had our relationship to the public was conducted entirely through the media that we work for. So we were a business-to-business organization. We provided our clients with film, and they would publish it and answer any questions about it. Now we have a direct dialogue every day, multiple times a day, with the public. And so anything that helps us verify our images is obviously critical. But you see with Ron Haviv and Eric Bouvet were in Ukraine last week photographing evidence of war crimes committed by the Russians. And you can see on their Instagram feeds and on their Twitter feeds every day the veracity of the work being challenged. People saying it didn't happen. You faked it. That was made up. It was photographed somewhere else. So this kind of initiative for us is absolutely critical because, you know, we have to demonstrate that the images are factual. They recorded what we say they recorded. The intent of the journalist is something else, of course, but we need to demonstrate that we have the intent of challenging people who challenge the authenticity of the work. It's fundamental to us. It's fundamental to our business, and it's fundamental to everything that we believe in about, you know, the importance of journalism, the importance of documentation, and the importance of bearing witness.
Yeah, no, I think it's clear to me over the decades that I've been working in journalism that the information space has become one that everybody is now trying to control. And some people say it started with satellite television, and then when the internet evolved, it became a deeper problem. And I would argue that in some ways, clearly, journalism has become much more dangerous, because actors can now see the results of the work in real time, and it gives them an incentive to control it for their own purposes. And so, you know, validating imagery is absolutely fundamental. Phil, getting back to you, and we were talking about this earlier today, we're starting to see the proliferation of what we call synthetic media, which is computer-generated images. It started a few years ago with computer-generated faces for use in stock photography that, you know, meant that you no longer required a model release. But now we're seeing technology that allows you to generate images based on search terms. How do you think that the proliferation and impending deluge of synthetic media is going to influence the news industry and the issue of trust in general?
Well, it's interesting because there is a lot of discussion about deepfakes. And at the moment, we don't see a lot. And when we have seen them, like we've seen with President Zelensky's video, it was reasonably crude and able to be debunked pretty quickly, or pre-bunked by his team, which is one of the solutions, knowing that something is a risk. His team communicated incredibly quickly with no, we're not surrendering, here I am, and that was, I guess, what you would call pre-bunking. I think one of the most important things is, it comes back to the journalism, because we're already working in that context where fact checkers and journalists are having to pose that question. Is this real? Does this make sense? So that's the context in which we find ourselves working. But I think, again, to come back to the issue of what I would call cheap fakes, or what some people call shallow fakes, that is so effective. You can spend a long time putting together some incredibly manipulated, brilliant, synthetic fake that everybody thinks is President Obama or Zelensky and what have you. But you can, for nothing, flood social media with things that are really badly done and easily debunkable. But the effect of that, the effect of the volume, the effect of the way people are interacting with that content, is really, really significant. I think probably the example people remember is the video of Nancy Pelosi, the US Speaker of the House, which was slowed down to make her look drunk and so on. I mean, sure, fact checkers could fact check it, and it was proven to be false and proven to be manipulated. But by then it had been seen 5 million times, and by then it's entered into the false information ecosystem. And there's a certain amount of the population, a significant amount of the population, that you probably pose that question to now, and they're probably convinced she was drunk, and that's what it was. So I think that for us remains the focus now. Going forward again on deepfakes, it's got to be through collaboration, because media do not have the technical firepower and technology to do that. We really have to be working across collaboration, and everybody coming up with the same standards and working together on that.
And for you, Laura, the same question about the ramifications of synthetic media. What's the BBC doing about this, or what are you doing about it in your involvement with all of these organizations?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating one because I've heard synthetic media called Deepfakes for good, which is kind of slightly hilarious about a face on it. We're working with the Partnership on AI, who are a fantastic organisation concerned with the ethics of AI, making sure that AI works to human benefit rather than the other way, to its disbenefit. And a piece of work that they're doing, and another piece of work we're doing with a really remarkable guy in the UK called Henry Ajda, who's also looking at ethics in that whole world, is starting to really open up conversations around what should we do? How should we signal when we're using synthetic media? You know, even if it's not something that's come out of the ecosystem as a deepfake, should we be very clear with our audience about what we're doing and by marking it? And some of you may have seen the Welcome to Chechnya documentary where the deepfake faces were kind of marked in a certain way to make it clear that this was not, you know, you were not seeing something that you know, you might have expected to see. So they'd actually use deepfakes to put faces on instead of using the usual pixelation, which gets really clumsy. So there's that aspect of it. There's a lot of work around what we should be doing in terms of deepfake detection. And as Santiago said, you know, I think there is a really interesting academic community around that. We in the BBC, even with an R&D department, you know, which is great, which is where I work, so I would say that. But it's, you know, even they felt that looking at tackling deepfakes was a bit, you know, was a really, really specialist area that we didn't particularly necessarily want to get into. There were others doing it who were doing it well, but nobody does it very well because there is this arms race. So I think we have the kind of the deepfake stuff, we have the synthetic media, the kind of deepfakes for good, you know, how we're going to use this incredible tool which enables us to be so creative and place people in you know, different places. I've been to a couple of the metaverse sessions, you know, where there's lots of crossover with this world. You know, when we're exposing people to immersive things which are not real, how do we make sure that they kind of feel that it might be a wonderful experience, but it isn't real? We've gone through this discussion a few times, and it'll happen, you know, I think in greater depth over the months to come. So I think we're in a fascinating place. I think the deepfakes will get better. I was very surprised as well that we haven't seen more and better. Quite relieved. But I think, you know, we're going to see that. We're going to see some kind of horrible, life-changing ones that, you know, will get out there and do that job of being very, you know, very difficult to halt once, you know, once they've reached their kind of their audience on social media. And I think just finally on this, there is a kind of related issue which has been discussed at this conference, this festival, really well today, which is around what you do when you have something like that. Because there's one school of thought that says you do not publish it, you know, just sit on it. If you've seen it and you know it's out there, don't give it any oxygen of publicity by talking about it. And another school of thought, which is very, very well discussed by Emily Bell today, which is around, no, actually, you know, there is merit in saying this is, you know, a piece of propaganda, I'm starting to use that term again, that's come out of Russia or wherever, and this is why we're going to talk to you about it. So I think there's a kind of really interesting debate that's unfolding about to what extent you use this content once you have it.
Right. We've been talking at the Content Authenticity Initiative to a number of companies that create synthetic content, you know, for positive purposes in the sense of entertainment, or avatars to communicate amongst businesses, and things of that nature. And the companies that we've been talking to are keen that it is understood by the public that what they're looking at is not real. And that's encouraging. The issue, of course, is, as usual, when this technology gets into the hands of bad actors. And so that's why we think that the provenance, being able to demonstrate the provenance, or conversely, the absence of provenance data, can be a signal that something is suspect. Gary, you were, through the VII Photo Agency, one of the sort of organizations that we partnered with early on last year to sort of practically work with these tools. We gave you some very sort of clunky, basic prototype cameras. And then, you know, we were able to publish on your website the content credentials and expose them. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned as part of that, understanding that it was a very preliminary step in the work?
Sure. I mean, the technology was certainly early, but that notwithstanding, you know, it wasn't an impediment to creating the work at all. You know, and certainly the first cameras that we get, you know, that are equipped with this technology will be, you know, far superior to the phones that we were using. So there was no impediment in the workflow. That was pretty seamless. And the interesting thing for me, I anticipated that the photographers might somehow be a little uncomfortable revealing the process that they go through to you know, tone and produce the work that they do. And in fact, I think you and I had a dialogue about that. One of the academics in New York was very keen that we didn't show what we do to an image, because any image that you record on your phone or on your camera, of course, you need to adjust, just as you would with a black and white negative. But the photographers loved it. They embraced it. And I think, you know, they understand more than anyone the need to, you know, create trust in their work. It's absolutely critical. So it was a pretty fluid process, actually, and I think they felt that there was nothing to hide. You want everything to be transparent. You want the public to see what you do, because they can differentiate between that and, Santi, what you showed me this morning, which it was horrifying, because I think we have arrived at this space where AI is very, very difficult to detect. You know, Santiago showed me an app where you could write in, show me a photograph of 6 mice dressed as elves in front of a log fire at Christmas. And it would generate an image that was incredibly convincing. I mean, amazing. I was really blown away, terrified.
You know, with synthetic imagery, broadly speaking, there are 2 different kinds right now. One is what they call generative adversarial networks, which is 2 computers that house large data sets and are ordered to construct something like faces or something rudimentary, composite faces with my mouth, your hair, his nose, their ears, whatever. And that's scary enough, because that technology is now able to create synthetic faces that are deemed more trustworthy than real faces. So that's kind of scary. But if you think that's scary, what Gary was talking about, which is this sort of generative synthetic media where you type in search terms, and instead of returning search results based on metadata, the computers actually generate images based on your search terms. There's a new app out there doing this called DALL-E, D-A-L-L-E, sort of in reference to Salvador Dali, I suppose, the painter. But check out that work, because that is completely amazing, both fascinating and terrifying at the same time.
And with that in mind, though, can you imagine typing into that search engine Ukrainian soldiers committing war crimes, executing Russian soldiers in this place, you know?
Yeah, at the moment, Dali have a disclaimer on their website that says they won't allow this to be used for nefarious purposes, which is great, and I applaud that statement, but it's only a matter of time before that same technology falls into the hands of you know, really bad actors. Sure. Phil, you know, AFP is one of the largest news agencies in the world, and your business model is essentially licensing content to other media organizations that then show it to the public. How have your media customers been reacting to the work that you've been doing around fact-checking and the work that we will do together around Provenance?
I think there's, again, I think it's been a journey since 2016. The big event, obviously, again, I go back to the US elections, of people starting to understand that there was this alternative information ecosystem. And, you know, I think many traditional media were blind to that. I mean, I remember in France, when we had the yellow vest protests, you know, there was this sort of idea that they came out of nowhere. They didn't come out of nowhere, they came out of huge Facebook groups on Facebook at the time. You know, that's where they were, hiding in plain sight for months and months and months, organizing protests. And so, you know, I think there was an understanding from many clients that we're really flying blind in this world. And I think since 2016, people starting to understand the scale of the challenge, the scale of the threat to their businesses, and the loss of their readers, knowing that they're going to have to either win people back, and they're going to have to do things that, once again, value journalism. And valuing journalism is about showing what it's about, you know, the show and tell, which, again, what we're talking about here is part of that, proving how it's put together. And it's interesting what you were saying, Gary, about the photographers being happy about this transparency process. And really that's what fact-checking is all about. It's showing you how journalism is done and ultimately raising the standard of journalism, because you can't fact-check with anonymous sources because no one's going to believe you with an anonymous source. It's no good saying my source tells me this is untrue because people don't believe the media. So you have to identify the person who's going to tell you that this thing is not true and prove why you can do it. So I do think there is this understanding of the scale of the problem, and that's really built over, if you look at all the big stories of the last 2 or 3 years, I would say the biggest theme of those big stories has been truth and lies. The US election, truth and lies, who's going to win, And on this occasion, Donald Trump didn't win, but if he had won, it was a victory for lies. The pandemic has been a battle around the world between people who believe and people who don't believe. And vast amounts of people, huge sections of the population, don't believe. And that's already seeding, it's interesting. I was just talking to my global fact check editor just before this discussion, and we think that we're debunking all the Russian propaganda, and that's only being viewed by people in Russia, and here everybody understands it. There's a huge amount of people in France and the United States, all over Europe, who are absolutely believing this stuff. Why? Because it's already been seeded. It's all the anti-vax people. It's all the movements that are already against governments and suspicious of governments. This audience is already there and taking it in. So, I think all our clients are now starting to understand the scale of the battle. Everybody's starting to raise their game journalistically, and everybody is looking for solutions because they're going to lose their audience if they don't.
Right, that's a very good point. There are obviously billions of smartphones in the world today, and most of them have cameras on them. And as a result, anytime something happens, we get blasts of what we call in the media industry UGC, or user-generated content, or citizen journalism. Laura, I know the BBC has been instrumental and an early practitioner of sort of scooping up UGC and using it. I remember the first instance of UGC that I saw was from the subway bombings in London, several years ago, where there was no way that independent journalists could get down underground, and somebody at that time had made some very rudimentary images with a BlackBerry device, super low resolution. The quality of the images was horrible, yet they were very compelling documents. And you guys picked them up, and when the AP saw that, we picked them up, and they got the exposure that they deserved. But as you see that flood of user-generated content, how, as a news organization, do you approach it, and what are your views on it?
We're incredibly lucky because we have a history that goes back even beyond that. So BBC has a wonderful department called the monitoring team, and they were looking at sort of photographs of buildings in Baghdad and saying, well, that's not a phone number from that area, way before we ever got into the sort of situation we're in now. So they're very experienced. They've looked at a lot of things over the years. They've learned how to kind of, cut their way through. I think the rise of, what we started to call citizen journalism, I think that term's gone away a bit now, but, when we started to look at that, I think that there was a great benefit in it because we were getting material we would never have otherwise got. As you say, Santi, we just simply wouldn't have got those shots because we didn't have a journalist handy there. It's great, but it's also, I think, fed into the whole disinformation thing, because if you consider that everyone can be a journalist, everyone can also be an expert, and you've got people kind of making their whole livings online now around, debunking things that we think are true around vaccines and creating all sorts of different narratives. So I think, there's a kind of real double-edged sword to UGC. We now have a team in the BBC which is a really good and very well-led team which looks at UGC from the point of view of really sort of diving down into what an image is, how we can verify it, how we have a huge range of techniques that we can use to see whether that image is right. But also I think there's something which comes behind that now, which is intent. So why is this person sending you this image? Do they want money? That's fairly clear. That's fine. They might want money. We might give it to them. Not often, but there you go. And we also have to question, though, what else might be going on here? Because when you see these kind of things happening now, it used to be the case that somebody would just happen to be in the right space at the right time with the phone, and wow, they got. But these days that's not the case. These days there are more things out there happening, which will mean that we have to go through a process of what is motivating this individual. And just to take it right back in a circle to CAI and Origin and C2PA, certification of, of where a source comes from. We need to be clear that if somebody says they are Joe Bloggs sitting in a house in Macclesfield, is that true? Is that true? Do you remember the teenagers in the Macedonian basement? They got a big bad rap, didn't they? But, is that something which is coming out of a disinformation factory, or is it something which is genuinely coming from a member of the public? And these are really tough calls, and I have huge admiration for our UGC teams that have to deal with this every day. And I'm really hoping that some of the things we've been talking about, will help with that, because individuals could help to verify what it is they're doing, if they're acting with good intent, and that could help us to make those decisions on that content.
Right. Gary, let's talk a little bit about education. You've done a lot of amazing things in your career, but most recently you've been focused on the VII Academy,
Yep.
VII Academy, which is really dedicated to educating and growing new generations of visual journalists, especially in the majority world, should we say, the global south. How do you see media literacy fitting into that education, and how are you addressing it in your education programs?
CIR, media literacy, is a huge part of what we train. So we've trained about 700 young men and women in the majority world in visual journalism. Media literacy, ethics, all of these issues are really key, because we believe, and I think everyone here would agree, that for a large part, the future of foreign journalism is going to be in the hands of local people who come from the countries that we're reading about, not folks like us flying in. And for us, if we get harassed or aggressed on social media, it's annoying, it's aggravating, but we can fight back. We have the tools to fight back. This happened in the States in 2019, in January the 6th, for example. But for the men and women we're training who come from Bangladesh, from Myanmar, we have a number in Myanmar, in Zimbabwe, in Ukraine, in Russia, this is not an issue of being harassed and aggressed. It can be an issue of life and death, imprisonment. So being accused of producing fake imagery, fake news is critical, absolutely critical for them, life-threatening. So things like this are super important for them. When the technology is affordable and available, I hope we can get it to them.
I think we're going to wrap it up, but before we do, a couple of things I'd like to add is that while the CAI is focused on the media use case, because we see that as being the most urgent use case right now, given the dangers of mis and disinformation, the issue of provenance is something that is gathering a head of steam in all kinds of areas. So we're getting interest in this project, for example, from insurance companies. How does an insurance company know that the image that you submit with an insurance claim is actually your flooded basement and not something you downloaded from the internet? Or medical imagery, how does one know that that image of a CAT scan is real? Or satellite imagery, how do we know that those satellite images of Russian tanks in Ukraine are real? Or law enforcement, how does a court of law know that imagery entered as evidence by a police force hasn't been manipulated to change the narrative? And so really what we're seeing in those areas where veracity is important, a huge amount of interest, but we're also seeing interest in the metaverse, as I think Laura mentioned before, and in the NFT world as well. And while those are areas that are very new and are developing, the notion of provenance of any digital file type is becoming increasingly important. And I think that ultimately will reinforce the use of provenance tools in our society as a whole and create the expectation that when you see something online, you will now have the tools to understand where it came from and what might have been done. So I think we have time for, if anybody would like to ask any questions, we have a couple of minutes left. If there are any questions from the audience. Sir. Sure. So the question for the live stream, in case you had difficulty hearing that, was from a gentleman from Bellingcat, the fact-checking organization, who do remarkable work forensically validating content from around the world from major stories. And the question was, why should people trust provenance sources in mainstream media, if I understood you correctly? And why should they trust the tool? You know, one of the things that I might say, as people understand, and they have done this to a large degree, the power of the imagery that they themselves can generate with their smartphones and their cameras that they might have at home, and in the proliferation of user-generated content or citizen media, the notion that if somebody is filming Russian tanks from the window of their house in Ukraine, and they want to be believed that that's actually happening, then the ability to turn on these provenance signals in their actual device, I believe, can actually help them present sort of more credible evidence of what's going on. And I also think it has to do with change in general and the change in habits. And as somebody who's managed change in large organizations for many years, one of the limiting factors around change management is often fear or lack of understanding of what's going on. And so this is why I think media literacy and educating people about where these trust signals come from and how they are generated is an absolutely fundamental part of this campaign. And I don't think that you can introduce technology absent that sort of media literacy training. And one of the things that we're thinking about as we move from the prototyping stage into the implementation stage, which is what we're going to be doing this year, and then moving on to video and other file formats as well. In the implementation stage, one of the things that we're thinking about is how to engage with the audiences of this kind of content, whether it's B2B providers being transparent about how it works, or whether it's B2C providers explaining to their readership and viewership what that little tick mark is and how it works, or whether it's getting this into the classrooms and making it a subject that is taught to children and young adults who can then socialize it and communicate it to their parents or to their peers. And so I think education is a massively important component of this. And I think it's also important to note that Adobe, who's been driving this, is a technology company. And so what we're building are tools. We're not being prescriptive about how those tools should be used, nor are we saying this is true and this is false. What we're saying is that with these tools, you can understand where something comes from and make a much more informed judgment about its veracity, which works in concert with the existing trust models that exist, or to whatever degree that consumers have with media organizations. I think that would be my response, but I'd welcome anybody else on the panel.
No, I mean, I think it's an extremely good point. It's one of our great challenges is, you can get to the end and fact check something and prove something to be false with all your tools that you have, and there's a huge amount of people who are not going to believe you because you are who you are, right? I get that completely, and I think I think I'd just come back to the point probably I'd make at the beginning, that if we're going to tackle, by the way, Bellingcat almost becoming, I suppose, part of, you're so well known now, you're almost becoming part of us, so you're going to suffer from that as well, But to come back to it, I mean, it really, this is just such a multifaceted problem. There is not it's very important, I think, to realize there is not a technology solution to what we're talking about. This is a tool among multiple things to tackle it. And the most unexciting and difficult bit is the education bit. Whenever you say that to people, people sort of go, oh. But it is. I mean, that's a really long-term, in the weeds thing of trying to educate people how to interact with content in this thing. It's not a glamorous part of the thing, and it's the thing. I was talking to someone at Google the other day, and we were saying it's the thing we always talk about last. It's number 3 priority, education, media literacy, because it's something that's long-term and takes time. But it really is attacking this program with this issue from the technology point of view, the journalism point of view, the education point of view, from the societal point of view, that we're going to make any progress. And if we don't do that, we're not.
Great. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up now. So thank you, everybody, for your time, and have a good afternoon.